Our story begins in April 2032 at the prestigious National Valkyria School. The host addresses the freshmen, asking if they are mentally prepared and announcing the start of the class allocation exam. The host explains that the first test will be a real combat challenge conducted annually where students must defeat goblins. The host informs them that the test will be broadcast live, encouraging citizens who support the school to vote based on their evaluations. As the broadcast begins, viewers comment on the strength of the freshmen, noting that the school has maintained its reputation. The host reminds the freshmen that the exam results will significantly influence their futures, urging them to fight with all their strength to secure a place in the upper classes. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, goblins stand on alert. Suddenly, a man with red hair strikes a goblin with his gauntlet, prompting viewers to wonder in the comments if the relics provide wind power for added speed. Elsewhere, a young woman with long white hair effortlessly slashes through a goblin with her sword, leading viewers to cheer and note that a cute female warrior has appeared, showcasing both strength and impressive relic abilities for close and long-range combat. Another woman then appears, wielding a massive spear, and swiftly stabs a goblin. Viewers react with astonishment, commenting on her immense power and noting the contrast between her small stature and the large spear, a romantic sight to some. Citizens watching exclaim that this year's lineup is incredible. One viewer even asks if they should choose the cute one from earlier, though others joke about choosing responsibly since freshman tuition is funded by their taxes. Soon, the voting begins. At National Valkyria School, strength is the ultimate measure, with the powerful assured of wealth and fame even as students. Suddenly, a loud scream echoes, causing viewers to laugh and wonder where the sound came from. The drone camera quickly finds the source. Asahi Hinata, the protagonist, charges at a goblin, shouting at the top of his lungs. His outfit, a striking yellow and orange suit, captures attention, and viewers ask about his tacky attire, wondering if it's his relic or if he has somehow dropped it. The goblin retaliates, hitting Asahi with a hammer. Viewers mock his apparent weakness, calling him a dark chapter in the school's history and questioning how he even got accepted. Asahi notices a tree branch nearby, picks it up, and is suddenly electrocuted, leaving viewers puzzled about the source of the shock. The suit system notifies him that he can't equip the branch because he is still in a beginner's suit. The goblin approaches and repeatedly attacks him, forcing Asahi to defend himself as best he can. Minutes later, Asahi lies beaten on the ground, prompting viewers to panic and call for medical help, even alerting the principal about the student in danger. Despite his condition, Asahi struggles to his feet, sparking viewers' curiosity about his persistence. Finally, he discards his suit and, clad only in his underclothes, hurls the tree branch at the goblin, leading viewers to realize with laughter that his trashy suit was, in fact, his relic all along. The nationwide broadcast of Hinata's feeble performance was undeniable proof of his ranking as the lowest in the school, marking the beginning of his school life in that tacky suit. Then, one day, another worldly war erupted and, in only a few years, drove the world to the brink of destruction. Most conventional weapons were ineffective against the threat, leaving humanity waiting in despair. When Hinata was young, a massive dragon appeared overhead, gathering flames in its mouth before releasing a torrent of fire in his direction. Yet, in that moment, a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of a relic. Relics are objects created when a person makes contact with materials from another world, manifesting a piece of their soul. Hinata's father wielded a shield-type relic to protect the citizens, and he became Hinata's role model. But one day, while shielding them, his father yelled for him to take Shizuku and run, urging him to grow strong enough to protect others. As his father's shield slowly melted under the dragon's fire, Hinata, in tears, tried to reach him but stopped, turned around, grabbed Shizuku, and ran as instructed. The feeling of helplessness that day left a permanent scar, motivating him to train tirelessly, his father's words echoing in his heart. Half a year has passed since he enrolled in the nation's top warrior training school. Recently, he began to realize a harsh truth. In his classroom, Kiramura Takeyuki, a Class E student with a 2-star relic, sneered and asked if it wasn't about time for Hinata to give up. He ordered him to hurry and buy some yakisoba bread and milk as well, while Hinata sat on the floor, severely beaten. Takeyuki then poured milk over Hinata's head, laughing as Hinata clenched his teeth in frustration, realizing that hard work doesn't always yield success. As Hinata tried to stand, Takeyuki slapped a piece of paper on his back, warning him that he'd regret removing it before Takeyuki's return. The paper read "Hero appears," and Hinata silently endured the humiliation. He walked to the canteen to get Takeyuki's requested items, drawing laughter from the students who saw him and taunted him for shamelessly showing up in a hero costume. Walking down the hall, he spotted a familiar figure, the white-haired girl from earlier, who looked at him in surprise before passing by. He glanced back, knowing she was Mine's Shizuku, a childhood friend who, like him, had lost her father that fateful day. Since then, they had been close, supporting each other. But their relationship changed after entering the school. Shizuku was now a high-achieving honor student with a powerful relic, while Hinata was seen as a dropout with a mere cosplay relic. He had grown accustomed to the disdainful stares. A moment later, he returned to his room with the bread, only to be struck by a shoe as he entered. Takayuki shouted at him for taking too long, demanding if he had forgotten the instruction to hurry. A fellow classmate, a bespectacled student, chastised Takayuki for throwing his indoor shoe, but Takayuki scoffed, telling him to retrieve it himself. Hinata looked around the room, knowing that Class E was filled with students with low-performing relics and bleak prospects, a trash class that even the teachers ignored. Takayuki noticed Hinata's wandering gaze and, with a scowl, activated his relic, delivering a forceful punch to Hinata's stomach. Hinata knew that relics were typically restricted to designated areas, but Takayuki and his friends disregarded the school's rules entirely. Takayuki raised his gauntlet relic with a sense of pride, questioning whether Hinata was provoking him deliberately and suggesting that he might need to be taught a lesson. As Hinata doubled over in pain, his mind drifted to his place in Class E, the lowest class, where he was ranked at the very bottom. For half a year, he had endured constant beatings. A bespectacled student nearby mentioned that Takayuki was going too far and that Hinata's bread was going to be ruined. Takayuki remembered the bread but kicked Hinata in the back anyway, knocking him to the floor and sneering that, since he'd bothered to buy it, Hinata should repay him. A pink-haired girl watching the scene remarked to her friend that it was happening again, and her friend, a dark-haired girl, replied that Hinata's situation was truly unfortunate. When the pink-haired girl asked why Takayuki seemed to hate Hinata so much, her friend explained that Takayuki's placement in Class E was partly due to Hinata's unexpected persistence in the initial placement tests. In a mock battle meant to assess relic performance, Hinata's relentlessness had resulted in a poor evaluation for Takayuki, who lacked a decisive finishing move. The pink-haired girl observed that Hinata was still just as persistent as he had been back then, to which her friend agreed, adding that there was a limit to how much one could endure while being repeatedly beaten, as Takayuki continued to kick Hinata. Takayuki then lifted Hinata by the collar, taunting him about his place in the hierarchy. Hinata's system displayed 9,990 out of 10,000, and he managed to smirk, which only further enraged Takayuki. Takayuki punched him in the face, raising the counter to 9,991. He didn't stop, hitting Hinata repeatedly as the counter climbed with each punch. Finally, Hinata was thrown into an empty row of chairs, lying still from the pain. Calming down a bit, Takayuki mocked the look on Hinata's face, calling it arrogance. He suggested that a weak relic must be inherited and taunted that Hinata's parents' relics must be trash as well. The insult struck a nerve, but Takayuki pushed further, implying he should meet Hinata's family to teach them a lesson, which made Hinata clench his fists in anger, biting his lip to stay calm. Unable to watch any longer, the bespectacled student called out to Takayuki, suggesting that it had gone far enough. Takayuki grabbed him, demanding to know if he was defending Hinata. Trembling, the student denied it, insisting he didn't care about trash like Hinata. Satisfied, Takayuki let him go and then ordered him to strike Hinata with a chair. Under Takayuki's intimidating glare, the student reluctantly picked up a nearby chair and, with eyes shut, hit Hinata on the head, pushing the counter to 10,000, meeting a condition Hinata had never anticipated. After Takayuki and his group left, Hinata remained on the ground, reflecting on his perceived weakness. Despite more than 10 years of rigorous training, he still doubted whether his efforts would ever truly pay off. Suddenly, a notification sound from his system startled him. It displayed a message, "Condition met for upgrade, take 10,000 damage." Hinata was surprised to see the option to upgrade his beginner's suit to the indomitable suit. Smiling, he realized that, while his efforts hadn't yet yielded results, he would continue trying until they did. Giving up simply wasn't in his nature. Hinata had long suspected his suit held a secret, a realization he'd come to about 6 months ago, shortly after the class placement exam ended. Now, heading to the school's basement training portal, he thought back on how badly he'd performed in that exam. He knew that, at this rate, he risked expulsion for lack of ability, just how things worked at Valkyria Academy. Funded by taxpayer money, the academy showed no mercy in dismissing students who couldn't prove their usefulness. Most enrollees, including Hinata, were those unable to succeed without government support. For him, expulsion wasn't an option, he had to stay. He also understood that sacred relics could grow stronger over time. The more they were used, the more their traits developed. But with his suit, he wondered if there was any special ability at all. Without one, he feared he was finished. Determined, he told himself he couldn't afford such doubts. This was his only path forward. Entering the training ground, he soon found himself exhausted and lying on the floor as a goblin approached. Aware of the real danger, he pushed himself up, considering whether he should try fighting without the suit, but dismissed the idea. He needed the suit to grow stronger. He recalled the time he'd been electrocuted when he tried using a tree branch as a weapon and had an idea. Hinata charged at the goblin, which raised its hammer to strike. He blocked it with his arms, wrapping himself tightly around the weapon. The suit system warned him that he couldn't equip weapons, delivering another shock. Despite the pain, he held on, determined not to give up. The goblin was electrocuted alongside him. Once he felt it was enough, he let go, watching the goblin collapse to the ground, electrocuted and disappearing before his eyes. Smiling in relief, he crawled over to retrieve the goblin's crystal, thinking that he'd barely made it and shouldn't try that method again. When he picked up the tiny magic stone, he was disappointed that it was all he'd received for his efforts. But then the stone vanished into his fingers, leaving him shocked. His suit system appeared, indicating that it had absorbed the magic stone and that the indomitable suit had responded, unlocking new features, an expanded system screen and an upgrade function. From that day on, Hinata spent nearly half a year deliberately enduring hits to fuel his suit's growth. Back in the present, standing in his school dormitory, Hinata activated his suit, knowing that the time had finally come. The system indicated that his beginner suit could now be upgraded to the indomitable suit. Curious, he checked the upgrade method, learning that only the suit's owner could use voice commands, with update as the keyword. Surprised, he immediately called out the command. The suit system lit up, and the suit gradually transformed. Looking at himself in the mirror, he noticed the change was subtle, yet significant. Though he had never heard of a sacred relic changing its appearance, he wondered if it had gained new performance capabilities as well. The system displayed the suit's updated stats: strength at 14, endurance at 18, intelligence at 0, physical ability at 11. With both skills and equipment aptitude remaining empty, Hinata stared at the screen, unfamiliar with this level of detail. Curious, he commanded the system to show more information, and it revealed that the indomitable suit granted powerful protection and a blessing of growth to its wearer. Though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant, he guessed his defense had improved. Checking the clock, he noted that the training portal was still open and wondered if he should test his upgraded suit's capabilities. Later, in the training portal, Shizuku dispatched a goblin effortlessly, slicing it in half with a single swing of her blade. She sighed, frustrated that the goblins were barely a challenge. Hearing footsteps, she glanced to the side and noticed Hinata entering from the other direction. A classmate joined her, asking if something was wrong, and then laughed upon noticing Hinata, commenting that he was the funny kid behind the broadcast mishap. Annoyed, Shizuku gripped her sword and, while walking away, told the girl that if she was so desperate for entertainment, she should consider dropping out to become a performer. When the girl asked if Shizuku was angry, she replied that she was simply fed up, muttering that Hinata kept raising her expectations only to let her down. Her friend wondered aloud why Shizuku disliked Hinata so much, then asked if his suit had always looked that way. Meanwhile, Hinata was facing a goblin. As it swung a metal hammer, he blocked the blow with his elbows, confirming that his suit's defense had indeed increased. He launched a punch at the goblin with all his strength, realizing that while he wasn't entirely immune to damage, the suit allowed him to withstand far more than before. He then landed a powerful uppercut, but the goblin didn't fall. Instead, it grabbed his head, surprising him. The goblin slammed him into the ground with force, leaving him bouncing back and crying out in pain. It then repeatedly struck him with its hammer, and though Hinata shielded his head, he quickly realized that just enduring attacks wouldn't help him win. He wondered if he should resort to the same risky method he'd used before. When the goblin finally paused, Hinata glanced up and was horrified to see that 3 more goblins had arrived. Panic set in as he wondered how they'd managed to get so close. Recognizing the danger, he tried to escape, but the goblins quickly overwhelmed him, striking his head, legs, and pinning one of his arms. Bleeding and desperate, he whispered for help, but then he recalled his father's advice: he couldn't rely on others. When things went wrong, he had to be strong enough to rely on himself and become the hero who helped others in times of crisis. Steeling himself, he snapped back into focus just as a goblin prepared to strike his head again. Catching the weapon with his hand, the system warned him he couldn't equip it, delivering an electric shock. This time, however, he held on, allowing the electricity to flow through him and into the goblins holding the weapon, electrocuting them as well. Hinata pulled his hand back from the goblin and pushed it away, then quickly distanced himself with a burst of speed. Turning to face them once more, he resolved that it wasn't a matter of whether he could succeed, he simply had to. Suddenly, the system notified him that his unyielding spirit had resonated with the fireproof suit, granting him a new skill, Revenge. As he read the details, the system revealed that he had met the activation conditions for this skill, meaning he could now use voice commands to activate it. Revenge would accumulate the damage he'd taken, convert it into power, and release it for 10 seconds, but it could only be used once a day. He had no time to think further, hearing the goblins charging toward him. Deciding to test the skill, he shouted Revenge, activating the ability as a countdown began. With renewed strength, he launched his fist forward, striking the lead goblin in the stomach and sending it flying into 2 others. He dashed toward them, delivering a powerful uppercut to the chin of one goblin and quick punches to the faces of the 2 goblins behind it. As the final second ticked down, he rushed toward the last goblin, channeling all his anger into a punch that struck its face, instantly defeating it. As the revenge effect faded, Hinata dropped to the ground, exhausted. The system confirmed that he had successfully used the revenge skill, and he realized it could serve as a valuable trump card in tight situations, though its daily limit and damage requirement made it a situational tool. He recognized that he couldn't rely on such a risky tactic every time, as he still hadn't fully grasped his suit's unique properties. Noticing a magic stone left behind by the goblins, he picked it up, and his suit absorbed it instantly. A notification informed him that the indomitable suit had absorbed its first magic stone, unlocking additional features, willpower reinforcement, a passive skill, weapon proficiencies in knuckles, swords, and blunt weapons, and enhancements to durability and physical abilities. Realizing he could continue growing stronger, Hinata felt a surge of excitement and determination. A week later, in the training portal, a massive goblin looked around and sniffed the air, unaware of Hinata above it. With a well-timed strike using his revenge skill, Hinata punched the goblin in the face, killing it instantly. Grabbing the goblin's magic stone, he felt a rush of satisfaction. He'd finally defeated a hobgoblin. His suit absorbed the stone, and a notification appeared, confirming he had achieved the condition defeat a hobgoblin for the first time, granting him an upgrade. Nearby, he spotted the goblin's massive hammer and picked it up, relieved that he wasn't electrocuted this time. He could finally wield weapons. The system displayed his new rewards: blunt weapon, sword, and knuckle proficiencies, level 1 impact resistance, armor aptitude, and increased durability by 4, with strength and athletic ability both raised by 2. Hinata felt it was worth the effort of defeating such a formidable opponent and was excited by the suit's transformation capabilities, now accessible while still wearing it. With the upgrade list unlocked, his relic had undergone significant enhancements. The upgrade list showed conditions for further strengthening the suit, most involving monster hunting. Each time a condition was met, a new power was instantly engraved onto the suit. Curious, Hinata tapped on impact resistance, which described a defensive skill that reduced shock from received impacts. He realized that, aside from revenge, he lacked offensive skills, and revenge was challenging to use regularly. He figured he would need more upgrades to access additional attack methods, but wasn't sure how to trigger them. Lying down to reflect on his suit's upgrades, he remembered that he'd unlocked revenge before the upgrade list was even available. He wondered when the indomitable suit condition had first activated and thought back to when he absorbed the mana crystal. But he recalled an even more important message mentioning an unyielding spirit. Pondering the possibility, he speculated that mindset, or perhaps strong emotion, might be the key. The next day, at the hospital, Hinata knocked on the door of a patient's room. Inside, his younger sister called out to him excitedly. Pulling up a chair beside her bed, he asked if it was all right for him to sit, and she happily agreed, proudly flexing her arm to show him her progress. She told him she'd been building up her strength for when she'd finally be discharged. To which he replied with a smile, saying he understood. She then swept back the curtain beside her bed, asking if he thought their mother looked a little better today, and he simply nodded. Since the incident 10 years ago, Hinata's mother had been in a coma, afflicted with a rare condition known as crystal disease, caused by the venom of certain monsters and for which there was still no cure. His sister had also been affected by the venom, but their mother's protective sacrifice had spared her from the worst. His sister had been gradually recovering, with doctors saying she might be discharged next year, though there was still one significant concern. A man in a suit entered the hospital room, and Hinata's sister, Hikari, excitedly greeted him as Mr. Jinji. Jinji greeted Hikari back, commenting on how healthy she looked, and handed her a gift, a bucket of fresh fruit, which she gratefully accepted. Turning to Hinata, Jinji remarked that it had been a while and whispered that they should talk privately. The two stepped into the lobby, where Jinji got straight to the point, asking if Hinata was ready to give him an answer. Kegura Jinji, the guild master of Phoenix, a guild founded to combat monsters and the same guild Hinata's father had once belonged to, reminded Hinata that supporting a frail younger sister and a terminally ill mother required substantial funds. He questioned whether Hinata didn't want to find a cure for his mother. Gritting his teeth, Hinata held back his frustration, aware that Jinji's apparent kindness masked a ruthless agenda. Hinata understood all too well what Jinji was really proposing. The crystals that formed in patients with crystal disease possessed properties similar to mana crystals, humanity's new energy source. Research on human-generated mana crystals was in high demand, with afflicted patients covertly traded as high-value test subjects. Jinji was, in effect, asking Hinata to hand over his mother as an experiment for a cure. Refusing, Hinata told Jinji he couldn't agree. Undeterred, Jinji reminded him that his father's inheritance was likely dwindling, questioning how much longer he could afford the hospital bills. Jinji added that, with Hinata's low-ranked relic, he'd never be able to support his family fully. Yet Hinata, resolute, replied that regardless of the difficulty, he would decline and protect his family as he'd promised his father. He warned Jinji again never to mention this to Hikari, to which Jinji agreed, adding that he wouldn't want Hikari to end up hating him. Throwing an empty can into the trash, Jinji told Hinata to reach out if he changed his mind, then walked off in frustration. Hinata returned to his sister and mother's hospital room, silently reaffirming his responsibility to protect his family in his father's stead. Hikari asked him about the conversation, but he merely said it was a secret, while reflecting that to truly secure their future, he'd need to join a reputable guild and earn enough money to support them. Sitting beside his unconscious mother, he resolved to become much stronger than he was now. Later, as he walked down the street, he glanced at his phone, noting that the school's training portal was still open. Deciding to skip his break, he pushed himself to train harder. Just then, he heard a woman shouting nearby. Looking toward an alley, he saw students in school uniforms harassing a young woman. Recognizing the girl, he wondered if it was indeed Yakumo Akane, his Class E classmate. He hesitated, deciding not to get involved, reasoning that it wasn't his business. One of the men taunted Akane, suggesting it was too late for her to pretend none of it mattered, and mentioned that their seniors were waiting. Confused, Akane asked what he was talking about. The women standing behind her mocked her, telling her not to play dumb and asking if she really didn't know what they meant. Another man asked if she hadn't done this before, to which she replied that she didn't know what they meant, and that it was all a misunderstanding. The man holding her hand pressed further, asking what she meant by misunderstanding and telling her he'd heard things about her from someone who knows her. He then implied it would be a problem if those rumors spread around school, making her hesitate. The man reassured her, saying that if she just hung out with them for a while, they'd let her go. Another man laughed, suggesting she could even make some money, adding that a senior thought she was his type and had a great figure. Akane remained silent, but then spat at the man, hitting his face, and raised a finger defiantly, telling him to screw off. The women behind her laughed, calling her intense. Wiping his face in anger, the man grabbed her collar and shouted at her to stop acting innocent, and just come along. Akane shoved him back, shouting for him not to touch her and insisting she hadn't done anything they were accusing her of. The man lunged to grab her again, yelling that it didn't matter and to just follow him, but another hand suddenly intervened. Hinata appeared, grabbing the man's hand before he could touch Akane, leaving her in shock and disbelief at his presence. The man pulled his hand back, eyeing Hinata's school uniform, while the women behind them recognized him. One sneered, saying he was the weakest in Class E and that his relic looked like cosplay. The man seemed to relax, realizing Hinata was the same student who'd caused the broadcast accident during the placement test. Approaching him, the man explained that they had business with Akane and asked him to step aside. But Hinata stood his ground, shielding Akane behind him. Angered, the man lunged at Hinata, calling him a little Class E bug and demanding to know who he thought he was. Akane worried that Hinata didn't realize these students were from Class C and thought he was getting involved with people he couldn't handle. But to her surprise, Hinata dodged the man's punch, grabbed his arm, and pulled him down, driving a knee into his stomach. As the man began to fall, Hinata raised his elbow and delivered a sharp blow to his back, causing him to scream in pain. Akane stood there in shock as Hinata rose to face the other men. Meanwhile, in the Valkyria Academy kickboxing club, Shizuku was sparring with her trainer. She stood silently, facing her opponent, until he launched a punch in her direction. She swiftly deflected it, raised her foot with speed, and aimed a kick at his head, stopping just short of making contact. She lowered her leg, and her sparring partner, Takahashi, admitted his defeat, complimenting her on her skills. Bowing in thanks, Shizuku expressed her gratitude for the practice, to which Takahashi replied that her martial arts skills were impressive and more advanced than he had expected. Takahashi also mentioned he'd heard her sacred artifact was top tier, adding that she was remarkably diligent. Shizuku replied that there was always room for improvement, explaining that her goal was a modest one, excelling in martial arts, as she had little else to take pride in. Back in the alley, Hinata positioned himself protectively in front of Akane, who watched with surprise, recalling how helpless he had seemed against Takayuki. One of the men, wearing a cap, rushed at him, calling him a name, but Hinata quickly tackled him before he could strike and slammed him to the ground. Another man tried to restrain him from behind, only for Hinata to elbow him in the stomach. As the man knelt, clutching his midsection, Hinata turned and delivered a swift kick to the back of his head, leaving Akane in awe. She began to realize that, without his sacred artifact, Hinata was actually quite strong. His weakness had only been an illusion. Turning to the men, Hinata asked if they wanted to continue. While he faced one of the men, he didn't notice the first assailant activating his relic behind him. The man, irritated by Hinata's confidence, fired a shot at him. Fortunately, Hinata heard the shot in time, blocking it with his arms, though the force threw him backward. He landed safely but looked at his unharmed hands in confusion. The shooter, frustrated that the attack had failed, wondered aloud if he had missed his mark, just as puzzled as Hinata about how he had blocked the damage. Hearing the noise, passers-by stopped and looked toward the alley, concerned by the sight of a relic in use. Some began calling the police to report the disturbance. The women with the group shouted to the men to run, warning that they'd be in serious trouble if the police caught them. Cursing in anger, the men hurried away, with one shouting a threat at Hinata as he went. Hinata remained silent, staring at his hand. Akane approached, asking if he was alright after taking a direct hit. He assured her he was fine, though he couldn't help but wonder why the shot had caused him almost no damage. Perhaps it had struck a less vulnerable area. As Hinata turned to leave, he told Akane he was heading off, but she stopped him, asking if he wasn't curious about why she was in that situation. He asked if she actually wanted him to inquire, to which she hesitated, eventually replying, "Not really." He shrugged, telling her that everyone has things they'd rather not discuss, and continued on his way. Akane called after him, asking why he'd helped her when she had never done anything for him. Surprised, Hinata simply pointed to the bouquet of flowers she was holding, asking if she was visiting someone at the hospital and suggesting she should hurry before it was too late. Stunned by his words, she watched him walk away, realizing that while she'd thought of Hinata as pathetic for enduring beatings without fighting back, he might actually be a decent person. The next day in the school hallway, Hinata was walking quietly when someone tapped him from behind. It was Akane, greeting him and thanking him for his help the previous day. As she thanked him, another girl asked what had happened. Akane was about to explain when they reached Class C, but suddenly a shot whizzed past Hinata's head, missing him by an inch, and the impact dragged him to the floor. The men from yesterday appeared, approaching him with mocking smiles and claiming he was late. The man in the beanie thanked him sarcastically for yesterday, reminding him they all went to the same school. Akane's friend watched in amazement, wondering aloud what Hinata could have done to make enemies of them. Akane shouted at the men, demanding that if they had something to say, they should address her directly. However, one of the men pushed her aside, saying they had no business with her at the moment. The man told Hinata that, while they'd been interrupted yesterday, here at school, they could do as they pleased. Sitting up, Hinata replied that they sounded just like the losers in Class E, prompting the man to punch him angrily, shouting not to lump him in with trash. Furious, Hinata tried to kick him, but a massive golden robotic hand appeared, blocking his attack. The man smugly explained that, with a sacred artifact, Hinata was no match for him. Grabbing one of Hinata's legs, he lifted him upside down while the beanie man bent down, taunting that he'd ensure Hinata was tormented until graduation. Suddenly, a shot struck the beanie man from behind. Akane had fired, calling him pathetic and telling him to stop. Angered, the man turned to Akane, noticing her relic and identifying it as an artifact that compressed and fired air. He sneered, pointing out that, although it was an emission-type relic like his, her artifact was vastly inferior. The beanie man aimed his relic at Hinata and asked if Akane wanted to see the difference. He shot Hinata in the stomach, causing the cap-wearing man to release his grip, and Hinata slid against the floor. Akane shouted, demanding to know what he thought he was doing, but the man calmly replied, telling her not to make a fuss, as he had only roughed Hinata up enough to make it plausible. While Akane argued with him, Takeyuki and the bespectacled student happened to pass by and noticed the confrontation. Hinata pushed himself up from the floor, surprised not to feel any pain, just as he had felt no pain the day before. He wondered if it was possible that the growth wasn't just in his suit, but in himself. Rising to his feet, the man mocked him, asking if perhaps he'd gone too easy. In response, Hinata activated his revenge skill, shouting its name and rushing toward them. The cap-wearing man tried to block him with his relic's robotic hand, but Hinata, recalling that his status window reflected his newfound abilities, realized he was no longer the weakest of the weak. With determination, he launched himself forward without hesitation. Hinata struck the cap-wearing man's relic hand, and to everyone's shock, his punch pushed the massive relic back, throwing the man across the room until he slammed against the wall. The students looked on in stunned silence, and the man in the beanie was bewildered, questioning how the giant relic hand, strong enough to stop a charging rhino, had been so easily overpowered. The beanie man stared at Hinata, baffled that he seemed perfectly fine even after being hit by a sacred artifact. However, his confusion grew when the cap-wearing man began to move, groaning and complaining about the pain but assuring his friend that he was otherwise fine, suggesting the attack hadn't connected properly. Hinata quickly realized that since he hadn't taken much damage, the revenge skill's effect was weakened, leaving him without a powerful finishing move. But he was determined not to just stand there and take hits. He squared his stance, ready to continue. Before anyone could react further, a professor appeared, demanding to know what they were doing so early in the morning. The beanie man muttered that it was pointless to keep fighting now, causing Akane to breathe a sigh of relief, though her friend remained skeptical, eyeing Hinata curiously. Nearby, Takayuki remarked that Hinata had scared him for nothing, sarcastically comparing him to a worm squirming underfoot. Laughing, he added that he'd be cautious for now but would make sure to beat Hinata to dust when the time came. Observing quietly, the bespectacled student noticed that Hinata had just fought Class C students and didn't have a single scratch, concluding that he'd grown much stronger. Later, at lunchtime in the male restroom, Hinata stood in a cubicle, reflecting on what had happened. He had always assumed his sacred artifact merely enhanced his suit, but he now realized it strengthened his physical abilities, too. This meant that the abilities displayed in his suit status could be used even without wearing the suit, which could be advantageous in a surprise attack. As he unlocked the cubicle door, he noted that his biggest limitation was still his lack of offensive power and finishing moves. Leaving the restroom, he wondered how he could reach the next level. Suddenly, Takayuki appeared behind him, mocking him for needing the restroom and standing next to him with an air of superiority. Takayuki sarcastically complimented him on his performance that morning but, activating his gauntlet, suddenly punched Hinata in the stomach. Hinata was shocked, not from pain but from Takayuki's audacity, and remained silent. Takayuki taunted him for ruining the fun and ordered him to go buy him some food immediately. As he walked away, the bespectacled student observed the exchange, realizing that Takayuki's punch hadn't affected Hinata as expected. It was clear that Hinata was hiding something, and he had become stronger than he appeared. Hinata stared at Takayuki, frustrated that he couldn't use his revenge skill again that day. Takayuki, irritated by Hinata's defiant look, demanded to know what his problem was. Clenching his fists, Hinata felt a strong urge to fight back. But before he could act, Akane appeared, interrupting them and telling them to wait. Takayuki, surprised, asked what she wanted and mocked her, implying she was defending Hinata again. Leaning closer, he suggested that she must want to protect Hinata. Akane met his gaze calmly and asked if he intended to hit her, even though she was a girl, and pointed out that such behavior would be pathetic. Gritting his teeth in frustration, Takayuki turned away, calling for the bespectacled student to follow him, who simply nodded in response. Once they'd left, Akane asked Hinata if he was alright, and he assured her he was. She clarified that she wasn't taking sides and told him he'd have to deal with Takayuki on his own. Hinata, curious, asked why she wanted to speak to him. She explained that Class C had targeted him because of her and she wanted to apologize. Hinata shrugged it off, saying there was no need, he'd gotten involved on his own. She smiled softly at his response. A little while later, on a bridge, Akane shared her story. She told Hinata that her father had fought monsters from another world on the front lines, but when she was young, he was defeated by a monster and had been bedridden ever since. Their family's financial situation had deteriorated, and her mother had started meeting various men to support them, eventually bringing a different man home each day. Later, her mother joined a dubious cult, demanding money even from Akane herself. Though Akane appreciated her mother's efforts to raise her, she couldn't reconcile these choices, so she'd come to the academy to escape. Akane went on to say that she aspired to become a great warrior like her father and earn money fighting on the front lines. However, she was currently in Class E, so her prospects seemed bleak. She explained that the Class C boys had approached her, aware of her situation, offering money and asking if she needed help. Though she'd rejected them, they persisted. When Hinata asked why she was sharing this, she replied that she thought it would be unfair to drag him into the mess without explanation. Smiling, she asked if he'd keep it to himself, and he returned her smile in agreement. She noted that the Class C boys had been quiet that day and had probably intended to confront him at lunchtime. Hinata agreed, and she advised him to stay on guard, warning that they'd cause trouble even at school. He teased her in response, telling her to be careful herself, and she shot back, telling him not to lump her in with cosplay characters. As she began to walk away, she turned back, telling him to call her Akane instead of you. Hinata smiled, silently agreeing as she walked off. Meanwhile, in the corridor, Takayuki muttered in frustration, complaining about being interrupted just when things were getting good. The bespectacled student agreed, adding that Hinata was going to get cockier if this continued. Takayuki clenched his fist, musing aloud about whether he should put Hinata in his place before that happened, and the bespectacled student awkwardly smiled and nodded in agreement. Takayuki then suggested they call Hinata to the bathroom where they wouldn't be interrupted, but the bespectacled student noticed something outside the window. Their classmate Kaori, Akane's friend, was talking to the guys from Class C they'd seen that morning. The bespectacled student excused himself, apologizing to Takayuki and claiming he'd forgotten his wallet, urging Takayuki to go ahead to the cafeteria. Takayuki looked confused but let him go. Rushing down the hall, the bespectacled student approached quietly, wondering if Kaori was arguing with the men to leave Akane alone, as she seemed to be shouting at them. But to his shock, he overheard Kaori chastising them, asking if they'd failed to follow through despite the setup she'd arranged. The man in the beanie apologized to Kaori, reminding her that he'd told her to stop dragging things out. Kaori shot back, asking if they realized they'd be the ones scolded by the seniors and venting about how many calls she'd received from them. One of the men retorted that it was because she hadn't shown up herself, adding that they'd been interrupted by pests the day before, and that Akane kept refusing their offers. Confused, Kaori asked if Akane had truly refused, questioning why, but the man only reminded her that she was the one who had said Akane had nearly been sold to a bar before escaping to the academy. The bespectacled student, hiding nearby, was stunned. The man suggested to Kaori that maybe she should just give up and go back to her own life, since Akane was only in Class E. He remarked that, as friends, Kaori was supposedly trying to help Akane, and she replied that her intentions were indeed friendly, saying she'd merely introduced her to someone who could help. The man in the beanie asked if that was really what she meant, but she deflected, explaining that many students at the academy needed money, and she was just trying to be helpful. Akane would likely appreciate it too, she added with a smile. Another man questioned if she was using her sacred artifact to influence them, to which she replied that her artifact only made people a bit more obedient and could occasionally make them feel good. She activated it, and the man in the cap responded in a dazed voice, echoing her words as if hypnotized. The beanie man told her to stop using her abilities on allies, and she complied, explaining that not all of them could prioritize attack skills. After all, some monsters from the other world were immune to her type of power. He asked if she'd be using her abilities on Akane this time, and she confirmed she would. He then reminded her that she'd failed in her last attempt, questioning if she was sure she'd succeed in summoning them properly this time. Kaori affirmed she would, brushing off his doubts, and the beanie man added that their seniors didn't know the meaning of restraint, meaning that her meddling could ruin yet another life. She dismissed his concerns, and he told her to meet him at the designated spot after school tomorrow, which she agreed to. Realizing he'd just overheard something huge, the bespectacled student felt a wave of panic. There was no way he could stop the Class C guys on his own, especially if their senior allies got involved. He doubted Takayuki would help, and even if he did, it wouldn't be enough. He then recalled the incident with the giant hand being pushed away, remembering Hinata's surprising strength. If anyone could stand up to them, it might just be Hinata. In the classroom, Akane sat by herself, thinking back to a time she'd called her father a hero. He'd told her he wasn't, but she disagreed, insisting that he was incredibly strong. Her father had explained that heroes fight without regard for themselves, whereas his only goal was to protect their family. He'd advised her to remember that a person with strong convictions is powerful. One day, however, disaster struck and the city was destroyed. Her father was rushed to the hospital, severely injured. She stood stunned, her mother hugging her tightly as they listened to the doctors. Although her father's life was saved, the doctors explained his permanent condition, leaving Akane horrified. Years passed, and Akane was in middle school. During a visit to her father in the hospital, her mother stormed into the room, lighting a cigarette. Akane reminded her mother that smoking wasn't allowed, but her mother ignored her, bitterly asking if her father had failed to wake up again. When Akane confirmed, her mother kicked his bed, cursing his inability to support them. As Akane tried to stop her, her mother vented about the crushing hospital bills and warned that once Akane graduated middle school, she'd have to start working, too. Left alone, Akane thought desperately of a way to cure her father. She'd heard about the glow basilisk, a rare creature rumored to have potent healing properties. With no one selling it, she resolved to get it herself by attending Valkyria National Academy, the country's only national warrior training school. Looking at her reflection in the window, Akane recalled her original determination. She wondered if her initial resolve had faded, especially after being placed in Class E and considering giving up. But perhaps, she thought, if she pushed herself to her limit, she could become strong, like Hinata. She stepped out of the classroom, where Kaori was waiting, asking why she was still there. Kaori activated her relic, saying she needed to talk to her for a moment. Meanwhile, in the hallway, the bespectacled student trailed behind Hinata, debating whether to speak to him. Though school was over, he knew he needed to say something but questioned why he was getting involved in something unrelated to him. Suddenly, Hinata turned, asking if he needed something, startling him. Hinata mentioned that Takayuki wasn't around, giving the student a brief moment to talk. Yet, he hesitated, uncertain about asking for help after all the trouble he'd caused Hinata. As Hinata began to walk away, the student saw Kaori dragging Akane along and immediately sensed something was off. He wondered if Kaori's relic was affecting Akane, but then reminded himself it wasn't his business. Frustrated, he turned and ran in the opposite direction, cursing under his breath, a sound that caught Hinata's attention. Later, in an abandoned building, the Class C men gathered with their senior, Sean, who was accompanied by a woman. Sean asked the beanie-wearing man if he was certain everything was set for today. Nervously, the beanie man confirmed, assuring Sean that there would be no screw-ups this time, especially since they had Kaori with them. Sean nodded, noting that with Kaori's involvement, there shouldn't be any issues. The woman beside Sean remarked that he must trust them quite a bit, to which Sean agreed, adding that thanks to certain connections, their operations had been profitable. Just then, the door opened and Kaori entered, holding onto Akane. She greeted Sean, apologizing for the delay. Sean reminded her that she was supposed to use her artifact on Akane. Kaori explained that things hadn't aligned perfectly with her plan. The woman took a closer look at Akane, noting that she seemed far too young for their purposes, but Ishijima, one of the men, replied that she'd do just fine. The woman then asked Sean if he intended to keep Akane for himself. Sean replied that while Akane was indeed cute, she was too young for that, so he'd have his fun and then pass her along to the others. With a face like hers, he noted she'd certainly be popular. Kaori turned to Akane, reminding her that she had said she needed money for her father. In a lifeless voice, Akane agreed, repeating that she needed the money. Sean shook his head, marveling at the power of Kaori's artifact, calling it terrifying. Kaori brushed it off with a coy smile, which made Sean chuckle, telling her not to act so modest. Then, his expression changed, and he warned Kaori that she'd picked up a tail. Hiding nearby, Hagan, the bespectacled student, froze in panic, covering his mouth as he realized he'd been spotted. He was terrified, knowing he wasn't strong enough to handle someone like Sean. He peeked out, contemplating escape, but Kaori spotted him and casually told Sean that it was just Hagan, a weak classmate of hers, so there was no problem. Kaori turned to Hagan, assuring him there was no need to run and asking if he hadn't expressed interest in joining their group. Hagan, struggling against his fear, denied wanting any part of it, but Kaori activated her artifact, insisting that he did, in fact, want to join. Under her influence, Hagan's expression went blank, and he agreed like a puppet. Sean instructed Kaori to make Hagan an accomplice to avoid any risks later on, to which Kaori agreed. She ordered Hagan to help Akane remove her clothes, and he immediately complied. One of the men set up a camera, saying they were ready to start recording. Trapped under Kaori's control, Hagan began to assist, realizing he couldn't move his body freely. His mind was racing, questioning why things always turned out this way for him. He thought about his tendency to stand by passively, telling himself he had no choice, unlike Hinata, who always persisted. Suddenly, Hinata appeared, delivering a powerful kick to Hagan's face, knocking him to the floor and snapping him out of Kaori's control. Kaori panicked at the sight of Hinata. Meanwhile, Akane, still under the artifact's influence, saw Hinata's back and began to regain control over herself, her vision clearing as she recognized him. In a shaky voice, she asked if it was really him. Hinata stood protectively in front of her, glaring furiously at the Class C students. Kaori asked Hinata why he was there, but he remained silent. Sean turned to her, asking who this was. Kaori replied that Hinata was a fellow Class E student, supposedly the weakest in their class. Sean raised an eyebrow, wondering what someone so weak was doing there. Kaori shrugged, admitting she was curious about that herself. She activated her relic, asking if he wanted to join them too, but Hinata simply asked her one question: weren't she and Akane supposed to be friends? Kaori, taken aback, asked him what he meant by that, to which he replied by asking if she was aware of Akane's family troubles. Kaori claimed to know Akane well, which was why she'd introduced her to this job, insisting she'd only been considerate. Hagan shouted in frustration, reminding her that Akane had already said she wanted no part of it. But Kaori used her holy relic to control Akane's responses. Annoyed, she speculated that getting hit earlier had snapped Hagan out of her control, but wondered when her relic's influence would finally work on Hinata. Turning to Hagan, Hinata asked if he was about to request something from him, suggesting that if it were Takayuki asking, Hagan would be more willing. Hinata added that he'd be open to hearing him out, and the beanie man laughed, mockingly asking if Hinata thought he was trying to play the hero. With a sneer, he remarked that while Hinata had escaped twice, this time would be his last. Activating his relic, the beanie man launched a powerful strike at Hinata, who didn't even flinch. He raised his arm to block it, sending the attack ricocheting upward. Kaori looked stunned, and Sean eyed Hinata with a newfound seriousness. The beanie man tried to downplay it, saying it was just luck, claiming that Hinata had accidentally blocked the attack. But Sean scoffed, telling him it was clearly more than luck. He asked Kaori about Hinata's relic, and she replied that she'd assumed it had no real abilities. Sean, however, knew better. No holy relic was without power, meaning Hinata had likely been hiding something. Kaori intensified her relic's power, but it still had no effect on Hinata, confusing her. No matter how strong someone was, her relic's effects were supposed to work eventually. However, thanks to the mental resistance granted by his willpower boost, Hinata remained unaffected. Suddenly, the cap-wearing man's giant hand relic appeared above Hinata, but Hinata noticed it just in time and leapt away, dodging the attack. The cap-wearing man cursed, frustrated that Hinata had evaded his strike. Hinata then shouted at them, asking why they were misusing their relics, reminding them that relics were meant to protect people from monsters of other realms, not to harm others. Sean simply smirked, laughing along with the others as they taunted Hinata for his idealism, leaving him looking at them with a mix of shock and confusion. Sean, now serious, asked Hinata if he truly didn't understand how the world worked, explaining that only a select few could enter government-sanctioned guilds, and most people couldn't make a living from their holy relics. He asked Hinata if he realized the effort it took just to obtain a relic and suggested it would be foolish not to use it to make money. As Sean activated his own relic, Hinata angrily challenged him, asking if making money justified preying on those working hard for a better future. Sean confidently replied that as long as he wasn't the one sacrificed, he didn't care who was. Sean added that Hinata wasn't alone in that outlook. Many would sell out friends for money, calling it a wise decision. Behind Hinata, Akane's eyes filled with tears, devastated by Sean's words. Sean then dismissed the idea of working tirelessly with no guarantee of joining a guild, calling it the choice of a fool. This final insult made Hinata snap. He lunged at Sean, throwing a punch, but the cap-wearing man's giant hand relic blocked the attack. The cap-wearing man mocked him, saying it was too bad, while Sean shook his head in disappointment, saying he'd expected more from Hinata. Sean added that the reason people treated him like prey was simple: he was weak. Furious, Hinata clenched his fists, pounding the giant hand repeatedly, thinking of how people like Sean and the others trampled on the weak, never satisfied until they'd exploited every last vulnerable person. With one final, rage-fueled strike, he punched the relic with all his strength, internally seething at their arrogance. Suddenly, the system activated, notifying him that his escalating rage had triggered a forced upgrade. As the giant hand moved to block him again, Hinata's fist connected with such force that it sent the relic flying, slamming the cap-wearing man into a nearby tank with a scream of pain. Everyone froze, stunned by what they'd just witnessed, as Hinata demanded to know if being weak was really such a crime, vowing to turn that belief against them. His system then displayed that his holy relic had evolved into the suit of rage, granting him greatly enhanced strength. He looked at Sean and the others, furiously declaring that he would become strong enough to erase people like them entirely. Hagane, standing behind Hinata, watched in shock as Hinata's suit transformed, marveling at how it could even be possible. Sean also observed the change, wondering if this transformation was an inherent part of Hinata's holy relic. Seeing Kaori's shocked expression, however, he realized that wasn't the case. Suddenly, Hinata appeared directly in front of Sean, moving with surprising speed as he aimed a punch at Sean's head. Sean dodged, only receiving a minor scratch on his face. Attempting to retaliate with a kick, Sean was surprised as Hinata easily evaded the attack. Kaori, looking worried, called out to Sean. He glared at Hinata, feeling increasingly cornered but recognizing that Hinata was somehow growing stronger with each move. Sean pulled out his artifact and picked up a water bottle from the floor. Pouring water onto the artifact, he informed Hinata that although he'd quit Class B, their innate abilities were on a different level entirely. Sean controlled the water, forming spikes, and launched them at Hinata. Yet, Hinata skillfully blocked and deflected each attack. Sean's frustration mounted, realizing that, under normal circumstances, Hinata's hands should have broken from the impact. He noticed that Hinata's movements were sharper, faster, wondering what in the world was happening. Raising a finger, Sean taunted Hinata, claiming he lacked experience. Manipulating the water on the floor, he directed it to rise and coil around Hinata like a binding knot. Sean shouted that he should have considered those with binding abilities and repeatedly struck him with water spikes, causing Hinata to cough up blood. Sean mocked him, comparing the feeling to being hit with a block of metal. Pouring more water onto the artifact, Sean explained that his holy relic was perfectly suited for combat, as he could freely control the water by sprinkling it on the relic. He told Hinata he'd chosen the wrong opponent, then sent a massive water spike at him. At that moment, an air shot deflected the water spike just in time, sparing Hinata from a direct hit. Sean turned, surprised, seeing Akane back on her feet. She coldly told him and his cronies that they'd been fools to think they could control her forever. Hagane, relieved, asked if he had helped her snap out of it, and Akane apologized, explaining that she'd been unaware of her own actions, including hitting Hagane earlier. Frustrated, Kaori tried to re-establish control over Akane using her relic, but Akane quickly fired an air shot, knocking the relic from Kaori's hand. Akane demanded to know why Kaori had betrayed her, but Kaori sneered, replying that it was simply for the money. Akane's face twisted with pain, feeling the deep betrayal. Kaori, unfazed, mocked Akane's reaction, saying she should be grateful Kaori had even bothered to use worthless trash. Kaori laughed loudly, enjoying Akane's anguish, while Akane, shaking with anger, gripped her relic tightly. Just then, the beanie-wearing man struck Akane from behind, taunting her for rebelling as a Class E. Hinata was still trapped, and Akane lay on the floor nearby. Sean sneered, telling them it was over and assuring them that he'd properly brainwash them later. He added that if it weren't for Kaori, things would have been much worse. But then Akane, trembling, pushed herself to her feet. She called out to Sean, admitting her frustration over not being able to get revenge alone. Fighting through her tears, she declared with newfound determination that she would work hard from now on and become much stronger. With resolve, Akane lifted her relic and aimed it at Sean, firing. Although the shot didn't harm him, it disrupted his relic's control, releasing Hinata. Shocked and furious, Sean glared at her. Akane, drained, dropped to her knees, looking at Hinata and asking if she could rely on him just this once. Hinata smiled, nodding, and told her to leave it to him. Sean taunted Hinata, saying that if he'd broken free once, it would be easy enough to restrain him again. Sean attempted to bind him in water once more, but Hinata activated his revenge skill and effortlessly broke free. He began walking towards Sean, calmly stating that he'd been listening to Sean's constant talk about trash and how Class E was nothing. Panic flickered in Sean's eyes as he unleashed water spikes in rapid succession. But Hinata moved forward, deflecting them with his fists. He asked Sean if he really believed that people at the bottom couldn't improve by trying. Realizing something was wrong, Sean grew frantic, noticing his attacks were having no effect. In his panic, he stumbled on an empty water bottle and fell to the floor. In that moment, Hinata appeared above him, raising his fist. With a steely resolve, he told Sean he'd show him the true power of trash. Sean shouted for him to stop, but Hinata's punch connected, striking him in the face and cracking the steel bar. Everyone was stunned by what had just happened. Kaori panicked as Hinata raised his fist to punch Sean again. But Akane's shout stopped him just in time. Hinata stood up, looking down at Sean, who was visibly shaken. The beanie-wearing man urged Sean to stop messing around and then aimed his relic at Hinata to attack him. However, Hinata simply blocked it with his arm and walked calmly toward him. The man, shaken, began to realize it wasn't just luck that had kept Hinata standing. Hinata grabbed him by the collar, lifting him effortlessly, and warned him not to mess with them again, adding that he didn't have time to waste on people like him. Paralyzed with fear, the man finally nodded, agreeing to back off. Hinata let him go, walking past a stunned and speechless Kaori, and approached Akane. Akane recalled her father's words, "Those with strong resolve possess real power." Smiling at Hinata, they high-five in celebration. And he joined her, both of them unaware that someone nearby was watching. Hidden in the shadows, the woman from before reported back to the principal, who was in his office, describing the unexpected outcome. She asked for instructions, to which the principal replied that there was no room at the academy for people who crossed certain lines. He instructed her to handle it as she always did, and she acknowledged the order. Reflecting on the incident, the principal considered how the recent disturbances at the school had revealed something surprising, making him anticipate the next evaluation exam, especially where Hinata was concerned. The following day, a crowd of students gathered around the bulletin board, where an expulsion notice was posted. It revealed that Koichi Tanuma, Tsuneyoshi Damon, Tomoharu Suga, the 3 Class C men, and Kiori Minamura had been expelled and were permanently forbidden from entering Valkyria Academy grounds. Akane asked Hinata if he'd reported the incident, but he shook his head, saying he hadn't. He reasoned that the 4 of them must have already been under surveillance, especially since the 3 Class C men had notoriously bad reputations. At that moment, Takayuki approached, asking what all the fuss was about. Hagane replied that no one knew the exact details, and Takayuki dismissed the situation as lame, mentioning he was hungry and inviting Hagane to join him in the cafeteria. Hagane hesitated for a moment, casting a glance at Hinata and Akane, but then turned and followed Takayuki, replying with a quiet okay. Hinata then suggested to Akane that she could talk to Hagane directly. She replied that Hagane probably had his own reasons for staying distant. Even when she'd thanked him the day before, he'd simply said he hadn't done anything and walked off. Hinata nodded, saying he understood, and started to walk away. Curious, Akane asked where he was headed, and he replied that he was going to the store since it was lunchtime. She decided to follow him, agreeing to tag along. Hinata, surprised, asked why she was coming since she'd brought her own lunch. She shouted back, asking if they couldn't just eat together, adding, "Lonely people should unite." Caught off guard, Hinata stammered in agreement, a smile breaking across his face. A moment later, Hinata and Akane sat on a bench, eating lunch. Akane looked at him in surprise and asked if his relic added new traits, pointing out that relics were typically supposed to develop existing traits. Hinata responded by questioning if it was possible he hadn't noticed that ability before. Akane suggested that maybe it was a dormant trait, so weak he hadn't noticed until now. Hinata shook his head, explaining that he'd been too busy to check the details yesterday. But when the rage suit was unlocked, he noticed the update list had refreshed with a focus on offensive abilities. He suspected the new suit addressed his lack of attack power and theorized that each update might be triggered by emotions. However, he wasn't sure what the next condition would be. Still, he hoped that, with each evolution, the suit would allow him to grow even stronger. Akane set her lunch aside, then stood up and seriously called his name. With a determined look, she asked if he would let her train with him. She admitted she might not be able to get as strong as him right away, but she at least wanted to be stronger than the beanie-wearing man. She explained she'd been trying, only to repeatedly fail. Hinata nodded, surprising her. He told her he'd noticed how, when she equipped her relic, her physical abilities adapted to the traits and proficiency she'd worked hard to improve. The fact that she'd only sustained minor injuries during the previous fight, he added, was a testament to her dedication. Akane's cheeks flushed, and she stammered that she still had to try harder. She extended her hand to him, smiling softly as she thanked him for his help and promised to grow even stronger. Hinata smiled back, shook her hand, and agreed to train together. Meanwhile, Shizuku watched them from the hallway with a frown, muttering to herself that the weaklings seemed to be enjoying themselves. Turning to a blonde girl nearby, Shizuku asked if she'd considered joining her team for the upcoming re-evaluation exam, saying it would be reassuring to have her on board. The blonde girl declined, and Shizuku nodded, telling her to reach out if she changed her mind. There was still plenty of time. Shizuku then walked off with 3 other students, leaving the blonde girl watching silently. She knew those 3 had a poor reputation for associating with the recently expelled students, and she sensed that Shizuku was aware of it, too. It seemed Shizuku only cared about a person's strength, no matter their character. The blonde girl glanced outside, seeing Hinata and Akane happily eating lunch together. She thought of warning Shizuku, considering that associating with questionable people could be risky, but she hesitated. The next day at the training ground, Takashima Gonzo, the homeroom teacher for Class E, shouted instructions, urging the students to train their bodies. He explained that there were various ways to develop the characteristics of sacred artifacts, but as physical abilities improved, so did the relics. As the students exercised, Gonzo reminded them that, although Class E lagged behind the other classes, they had an opportunity to prove their placement was a mistake and to show what they were capable of. Hinata glanced at his body, noticing subtle improvements, unaware that Takayuki was glaring at him with anger from behind. Later, back in the classroom, Gonzo announced that a re-evaluation test would be held soon, emphasizing that if they didn't turn the tables during this test, escaping Class E would be impossible. He encouraged them not to give up just because their sacred artifacts were ranked low, explaining that the evaluation would consider more than just relic performance. Physical abilities and judgment would also be assessed. Gonzo added that teamwork would be crucial in this year's test, sparking questions from Takayuki and Hagane about team formation. Gonzo explained that teams could consist of up to 5 people, and they would have to recruit their own members, regardless of class. Takayuki's frustration boiled over, angrily accusing Gonzo of setting up Class E for failure by expecting other classes to team up with losers. Gonzo calmly explained that finding and recruiting teammates was part of the test, as the academy aimed to prepare warriors for guild life, where cooperation was essential. He reminded them that expectations for Class E were already low, and that if they wanted to rise above it, they'd need to work hard. Takayuki fumed, blaming his placement in Class E on his misfortune and directing his resentment toward Hinata, whom he saw as the root of his troubles. Later, at lunchtime, Akane asked Hinata about his plans for the re-evaluation test. He responded with some confusion, so she clarified that she meant finding team members, suggesting that it would be ideal to have 2 vanguards and 2 rearguards. Suddenly, Takayuki approached, scoffing and asking who would want to team up with the weakest guy. Akane countered, asking why he had come over, and Takayuki retorted that she already knew why. He then grabbed Hinata, accusing him of getting too cocky lately, and demanded that he go buy him lunch immediately. Hinata glared at Takayuki in anger, but Akane intervened, telling Takayuki to get his own lunch. Shocked, Takayuki asked her what she just said and pointed out that, while she'd been spending a lot of time with Hinata lately, she surely didn't plan on teaming up with him for the re-evaluation test. Akane replied without hesitation, saying that teaming up with Hinata was exactly her plan. Takayuki fell silent as Akane, with pride, told him that Hinata was far better than him, especially since he had no sense of teamwork. Takayuki glared at Akane, demanding to know what she had just said. Unfazed, Akane turned to Hagen, asking if he didn't feel the same way. Hagen, taken aback, stammered, but Takayuki's furious stare turned to him. Grabbing Hagen by the collar, Takayuki demanded to know if he was actually siding with Akane and Hinata. Trembling in fear, Hagen quickly replied that it wasn't true and assured Takayuki that he planned to team up with him because it seemed like the wiser choice. Satisfied, Takayuki released Hagen, insisting this was the right decision. Akane, however, sighed in exasperation, doubting if that was truly what Hagen wanted. Takayuki shot Hagen a warning look. As Akane put the lid back on her lunchbox, she suggested that Takayuki and Hagen discuss their strategy for the re-evaluation test together since she didn't have time to deal with their behavior. Standing up, she invited Hinata to leave with her, and he readily agreed. A moment later, in the hallway, Akane told Hinata they couldn't count on Hagen and mentioned it would be ideal if they found someone else to join their team. Hinata hesitated, asking if she thought he'd be a strong enough teammate. She replied confidently that he'd do just fine and encouraged him to believe in his own strength. Giving him a gentle punch on the arm, she added that since others still underestimated him, they could surprise everyone in the test. Hinata smiled, agreeing with her, unaware that the blonde girl from earlier was watching them from a distance. She noted the change in Hinata's demeanor and mused with a faint smile that he might actually be interesting. Meanwhile, back in the classy classroom, Takayuki vented his frustration, kicking a chair and muttering angrily about Hinata's arrogance. Hagen attempted to calm him down. Regaining his composure, Takayuki turned to Hagen, suddenly serious, and asked if there hadn't been injuries or even fatalities during past re-evaluation tests. Hagen confirmed, slightly wary. Takayuki's lips curled into a smirk, noting that the re-evaluation test took place in a D-class portal, a dangerous simulation of real combat, where unexpected accidents were officially reported. However, Takayuki hinted that these accidents might be deliberately created. Hagen, alarmed, glanced at him as Takayuki drummed his fingers on the desk, musing aloud whether another accident might just happen this year.